Mason stood in the wreckage of his backyard, disbelief in his eyes, rage in his chest. His cherished terrace was gone, destroyed without warning, without mercy. This wasn't an accident. It was revenge. What came next revealed secrets that would shock everyone who'd ever crossed paths with the HOA. But let's start from the beginning. Mason Garrett had always taken pride in his home in Oak Brook Heights. It was more than just a place to live. It was a symbol of years of effort, a quiet retreat from the pressures of the world. The two-story house, nestled among tall trees and well-manicured lawns, had seen the growth of his children, countless barbecues, and late-night conversations with friends. His backyard patio was his sanctuary. It was where his kids played, where he sat with his wife on warm evenings, watching the sunset. But one summer afternoon, while Mason was at work, he received a phone call that shattered the calm of his life. The Homeowners Association, HOA, had come by and bulldozed his backyard patio, without warning, without a second thought. In one swift move, they erased the space that meant so much to him and his family, the area he had lovingly tended to for years, where memories had been made, was now just a pile of rubble. The HOA's reasoning was as maddening as it was vague. Apparently, Mason had violated a landscaping clause in the community's bylaws. The problem? The clause was so ambiguous that it was impossible to understand what exactly he had done wrong. There had been no notice, no attempts to resolve the issue through dialogue, just a swift decision and an even swifter demolition. They had destroyed the heart of his home without hesitation, without a care for the impact it had on his life. Mason could hardly believe it. His house had been a haven, a place where he had built his family's life. And now, in an instant, it felt like everything he had worked for was being taken from him. The anger welled up in him, but so did a sense of disbelief. How could they do this? How could a group of strangers, with no connection to his family or his history, decide to tear down something so personal, so meaningful? Mason sat there, staring at the ruins of his backyard, feeling an overwhelming sense of betrayal. The vibrant space that had once been a sanctuary for him and his family now lay in pieces. Broken bricks and splintered wood were all that remained of what had been the heart of their home. He couldn't believe it was real. How could something so personal, so important, be taken away so easily? He dialed the HOA's number again, hoping for some kind of explanation, some trace of empathy. But each time he was met with a cold, dismissive voice on the other end. The person would repeat the same mantra. Your patio doesn't comply with the community's aesthetic guidelines. No explanation of what exactly had been wrong. No acknowledgement of the impact it had on his family. Just a robotic refusal to listen, to understand. It was as if they had already decided, and nothing he said could change it. But it wasn't just about the patio. It was the deeper, more insidious power the HOA wielded over everyone in Oak Brook Heights. He couldn't stop thinking about how arbitrary their rules were, how they could dictate every aspect of his life with little regard for the people affected. The more he looked into the community's bylaws, the more he saw the suffocating control they had over everyone. It was not just a set of guidelines. It was a way of life that left no room for individuality, for freedom. The injustice of it all gnawed at him. His anger was not just about the patio anymore. It was about how powerless they made him feel, how powerless they made everyone feel. The more Mason learned about the board, the more disgusted he became. It was clear that Angela Fielder, the chairwoman, was the mastermind behind it all. Her smug demeanor, her sense of superiority, it all made sense now. She didn't care about the people she was supposed to represent. She only cared about power. And the more Mason thought about it, the more he was consumed by one question. How had she managed to get away with this? Mason's anger morphed into something far more dangerous, a burning need for justice. He could no longer sit idly by while the HOA destroyed everything he had worked for. Every moment that passed, his resolve strengthened. This wasn't just about a backyard patio anymore. This was about standing up for his family, for his home, for every neighbor who had been silently suffocated by the HOA's oppressive rules. He couldn't let them win. He spent weeks poring over the HOA's bylaws, his frustration and determination growing with each passing day. And then, buried deep within the legalese, he found it. A hidden clause. It was small, almost inconspicuous, but to Mason it felt like a golden ticket to reclaiming his life. The clause stated that any alterations made to a property without the HOA's express approval required the consent of at least 2/3 of the board members and a public notice. This was the smoking gun he needed. The HOA had never followed this rule. His patio had been destroyed without any approval or notice, and Mason knew this was his chance. With newfound purpose, he prepared for the next HOA meeting. His palms were sweaty, his heart pounded in his chest, but he knew this was the moment. He couldn't afford to back down now. The quiet, submissive neighbor he had been all these years was gone. He wasn't just going to show up and speak his mind. He was going to fight back, to demand answers, to expose the injustice. Angela Fielder and the rest of the board were going to have to face him, and they wouldn't be able to dismiss him this time. As the day of the meeting approached, the tension in Mason's chest grew heavier. He could already picture Angela's smug face, her calm, condescending demeanor, as she tried to brush him off. But this time it wouldn't work. He had the facts, the law, and his family's dignity on his side. He walked into that meeting with one goal: to take back what was rightfully his. At the meeting, Mason presented his findings. He showed how the HOA had violated its own rules by bulldozing his patio without proper notice or a public vote. The room was tense, and Angela tried to brush him off, but Mason's persistence and evidence spoke louder than her attempts to discredit him. As the meeting dragged on, the other homeowners began to speak up. Many had suffered at the hands of the HOA's overreach, and they rallied behind Mason. Finally, Angela was forced to admit that the HOA had acted outside of the boundaries of its own bylaws. The board voted to reverse the destruction, and Mason was awarded compensation for the damage. Mason walked out of that meeting with a sense of triumph, not just for himself, but for every resident in Oakbrook Heights who had silently suffered under the HOA's thumb. The victory was sweet, not just because he had restored his patio, but because the power of one person's determination had turned the tables on an unjust system. And as Mason looked out at his newly rebuilt patio, he felt a sense of peace return, knowing he'd fought not just for his home, but for the integrity of his community.